All right, folks, I think we're ready to get started with the report outs. I know this room, it's a little bit hard depending on where you're seated, if you could see what the other people are presenting. So feel free to get up and move around if you want to see what they have if you're not in a good space to do so. And just a reminder, every group will get 10 minutes to present, and we'll save all of our questions for the end. To the people who are presenting, I will be timekeeping. I'll be holding up my 3-minute, 1-minute, and time up cards. I'm a nice timekeeper. It's just really just to help you out. And then while you watch through the different report outs, keep in mind of what themes that you're seeing across all groups. Are there similar challenges with the groups? Are there similar issues? Think about that. That will be kind of helpful for our discussion in the end. And then before we get started, I just wanted to give a round of applause to our facilitators. That's a big job. And so thank you to them. Hats off to them for doing that. We thank you very much. So without further ado, and just a reminder, I did hear some people saying, what is this going to be used for, a couple more times. So all of this is going to go into the proceedings document, your report outs. We've got pictures of all of your lovely value chains, and this will contribute to the strategic document that will come out of this. And we'll talk a little bit more about that after the break later today. So we'll go ahead and start with group one. And why don't you start off by just reminding us of your theme and then go right into it.
So thanks. So our theme was increasing temperature and health. And we decided to start from basically the end of the value chain, and so I'm going to start that way too here. So we thought about how increasing temperature could affect human health in terms of just heat stress on the cardiovascular system, but also in terms of air quality, pollen, particulates, and things like that in the air. And we considered both the kind of longer term, larger scale needs and shorter term, more immediate and local needs. And so we thought about, how we might devise like mitigation systems to handle increasing temperatures and mitigate impacts to human health. And also on the short term scale, how we might have something more on the lines of a public alert system, okay? So that was the end of the value chain. We focused on particular applications. We talked about having a traffic management system that would actually during a heat wave and when there was problems with air quality might actually affect how traffic was managed in a city to try to minimize the amount of air pollution. Okay. So, the types of information that were needed. So we talked about the number, understanding what we thought here was what's needed is some information that's readily understandable and accessible by the public, okay? So it's simplified and it's presented in a way that's going to resonate. And with the public and also with the county decision makers, right? So, because there's a variety of responses. There's responses by individuals and there's responses by city managers, county managers, and so forth. So responses by government. So we needed demographic data. We needed some metric of heat stress or heat stress days. We needed understanding of other stressors in addition to heat. And we needed to understand also what were the mitigation opportunities, right? So then there was the issue of analysis. And so that was basically, that's the glue going from data to information. And what that's about is really creating a whole bunch of models and assessments. And it's more than analysis, actually, it's also synthesis, right? Putting in different types of data into information frameworks, bringing in various types of models, for example, prediction models, but also risk analysis models, economic models for trade-offs, a whole bunch of social and ecological models for how people react, behavioral models, right? Those kinds of things. All that is in this analysis piece. Okay, and data, what kind of data? Well, okay, here's a very brief list, right? So temperature, thermal, spatial data, met data, water data. Can't read this, but understanding of medical resources, medical data is absolutely critical if you want to do something, right? And so that's something that, as geoscientists, we don't necessarily focus on that much, but it's absolutely critical. And then different types of sensor systems. We talked about having people have sensors, right? So volunteer geographic information and or citizen sensors, also having optical sensors, thermal sensors, and so forth. And in terms of the platforms, we had some discussion on what's a sensor, what's a platform. Twitter, from my perspective, could be a platform. It's a network, right? Sensors, but obviously, satellites, remote sensing platforms. Then health data. That was a big issue that we also talked about, is how do we get health data, how do we deal with privacy issues, how we get health data in a way that's accessible very quickly, and so we can have proper feedbacks and effectively. So some of the challenges, well, the biggest challenge was the scope of what we're trying to do, right? How do we narrow that? It was pretty hard. We talked a lot about the traffic system, which was one of the ways. How do we, put together indicators of success? And are there issues with having different metrics of success in terms of what you want to achieve? How do you manage that? Maybe through some type of multi-criteria decision analysis or something like that. But then you have to worry about the weightings. There's issues with respect to that. How do you make sure that you've got the users in mind with this information system? How do you create user-centric design? How do we think about the counterfactuals? How do we manage that? That was a biggie, right? It's like, okay. Okay, so what else? Coupling social and behavioral data with, biophysical sensor data. Something that's critical, and trying to reducing. Another big one was reducing the number of false positives, right? So that whatever we did had credibility, reducing uncertainties in general, and there's a ton of work that needs to be done, and there's a lot of information out there. How to bring it all together and how to do proper value chain analysis, I think, is really tricky. Rich, did you want to add anything?
No. Did you talk about the back end to the front? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So another point is it's like, okay, we kind of have this linear sort of one-way direction here, but actually there's multiple feedbacks and short circuits, right? And so it's not a, and yes, to use my term yesterday, it is a garden of forking paths. So. Anything else that I missed, guys? No?
3 minutes left.
I got 3 minutes left. Oh my God.
Did you get unanswered questions?
Answer questions. Well, Emily, yeah.
So, did you think about current final products that would fit into this value chain, or were you thinking about hypothetical, something that would be developed?
Well, we were thinking about, the thing that we focused on was actually two things. One was the management of the traffic light system, okay, to help manage traffic during extreme heat days. But there was also an idea that popped up at one point about managing, fast transportation route for emergency vehicles, right? And so, that's a good example of how, if those are two things that you're trying to achieve, two objectives, maybe you can get them to align, but maybe not always, right? How do you manage that?
Well, we had it also, it was, do it again. It's about how do you actually define the counterfactual? The current system is the counterfactual, but do we really know what is contained in it? And that's how we kind of addressed, I think, what you're talking about.
Yeah, the problem is, it's like planning for these things is really hard, right? And so these things kind of evolve organically. And so it's one thing to have a plan, but what the plan is might not actually be how the system progresses.
But to answer your question, it's a hypothetical. We actually had that conversation part of the way, almost toward the end. We said, wait a minute, we're actually planning for something that could happen, a system that could be developed in the future, not trying to value something that already exists today.
And we'll have time at the end for questions as well. So thank you very much, Group 1. And we'll go ahead and go to Group 2.
All right, and Group 2, we're the flood group, and to demonstrate how well we work together and how collaboratively we're doing a joint report out here. Jason and I tag teaming here. So to address the kind of the flood issue, we decided that, similar to the first one, we had to start kind of working backwards. First, understand what questions were being answered by who and what was the process. We first had to define what kind of flood are we talking about. Are we talking about a coastal flood from hurricane? Or are we talking about inland flood from rain? And then we said it'd be easier if we think about a particular example and draw from that to at least set up a framework for us. So we're kind of focusing on, at least at the beginning, and then focus sort of lost us from time to time. But Hurricane Matthew. And so when we started dissecting that, we said, okay, Hurricane Matthew had inland flooding, had coastal flooding, it had all of those elements. Then we said, so what do we really mean, and what questions are we trying to answer about flooding? So with that, we had to start talking about the process. And we said with flooding, we had kind of so the structure of the value chain was, first there's the planning or preparedness stage, which is a little more long-term, where you can try to get ahead of it, don't build where you shouldn't build, things like that. And then the next is another part of planning, but it's kind of pre-event planning. You know this hurricane is coming, you know something's coming, so there's a different level of tactical planning for that pre-event planning. And then you move into the response. When something happens, the flooding is happening, there are response activities. And then from there you move into the recovery phase, and then finally move into more of kind of the economic impacts and assessments and some of that part. And it's a whole cyclical thing. So for this kind of high-level view, we then started dissecting, well, at the planning stage, who are the actors? Who's involved in that stage? So, because we had to deal with both the kind of the temporal aspect as well as the kind of local or federal or the scale of it, as well as planning in advance versus planning while something's happening. So we went through a whole scenario of different actors that are involved in the planning stage, then different actors that come into play when you're getting into the pre-event planning, and yet other actors, both in public sector, private sector, that cut across the whole response part, and those who would be consuming the ultimate information products that come out of this. So this was the high-level kind of view of how we approach this issue of flood. When we were talking about the actors, we also said, well, let's pick, is this a local government, the director of an operations center, or is this a FEMA person? Who are we talking about? And we got into, let's pick one thread and kind of get into that, and then we can extrapolate other players from that. And what we settled on is kind of critical infrastructure like a dam. And what would a dam operator need in all of these? What would their role be, and what would the information products or information needs for a dam operator be in each one of these phases of looking at the flood? So once we settled on that, then we really were able to start digging into it. And then I think I'm going to turn it over to Jason to talk about a little bit of the value, kind of the value chain working backwards, similar to that, the supply and demand of it.
Yeah, and so similar to what we saw in the first group, and what we discussed yesterday being a supply chain in a sense, then the demand side comes in, and the hinge between them is the decision being made. So we went through a lot about the complexity of the different actors involved in an event, the temporality of when a decision is being made, and then we tried to isolate one actor and one decision. So with the dam operator making a decision, and we have a whole number of decisions that a dam operator is going to make. Do you release the reservoir or not? when, how much, for how long, what are the impacts downstream, impacts to economic impacts, so if that dam is also being used for power generation or drinking water, any number of other things, you have to consider all of those things. So what information then does that dam operator need to know at different times in this sort of temporal cycle? And so we thought, sort of right around the pre-event planning, sort of our phase 2, you're thinking release or not. So what information is then needed? You're going to need to know how much water are you anticipating? What is my capacity? How much can I release downstream safely within the parameters that I have? And so we looked at information products, the weather forecast, the hydrology, information about inflow, river gauge data, upstream data, water level downstream. You're going to look at the models for looking at upstream and downstream impacts to that historical info. So what's your historical flood mapping or your historical understanding of the hydrology there? Your reservoir capacity, your storage capacity, demographics. So, if I release water downstream, and it's not just demographics as in humans, but also what's the built environment, what is below where I am, what is above where I am, the backflow as well. Property and community exposure. And so then we, decompose that. So take any one of these information products, and then that can be built in the constituent parts where you have, what we have in group 1, in our group, all of the groups we discussed yesterday, you have a platform. That platform has sensors. That sensor makes a measurement. That measurement is data that gets combined with other information to create a derived product, and that information product will serve that dam operator to make part of a decision. So, and I think the big issue that we came up with when we're talking about challenges and additional data is rarely are decisions based on a single variable or single criteria. So it's multi-criteria decision making. Many of these information products may serve part of one or more decisions, or they may only in conjunction with another piece serve a decision. So how do we understand the value and the interplay between those different information sources? How do we understand the interplay of the different data streams into an information product? And so understanding that, we talked about double counting yesterday. And so we had a lot of questions, I think, circling around complexity. So you have a complex cycle of temporal cycle. You have a complex sort of ecosystem of actors making a series of decisions that are generally multivariable decisions, multi-criteria decisions. When we talked about the dam operator, something that came into play is that federal dams have a federal management plan. So the dam operator may have newer information that may or may not alter how they would make the decision, but they're inside of a policy framework that constrains that decision. So how do you value the addition of new information where in that scenario, perfect information would not improve their ability to actually act upon it? So I think that came up, and that really brings up to the challenges and what additional data is needed. So complexity is something we looked at. The need for a wide variety of expertise. If you think about this entire system, we're looking at one operator making multiple decisions with many data streams. Bring that out for an entire event. So, and if you think about an event like Hurricane Matthew is our original event, that's a time-constrained and bounded event, and there's still hundreds of thousands of decisions being made by multiple actors there. The temporality of those decisions and feedback between decisions, and sort of the feedback also between the information, the operational information, scientific information that a decision maker is being given, and the policy and cultural frameworks in which they operate.
Right, that collaboration in the technology, keeping up with
Yes.
the advancements in technology and linking all these sensors and the platforms with Internet of Things and all of this to reduce the time between getting data and taking action in an informed way.
Absolutely. And also, how is the value or how is the decision impacted or modified by information sharing, communication, coordination? So again, you might have perfect information, but that information isn't shared to another actor. The efficacy of your intervention may decrease, and therefore, how do we value that properly? As Pat had mentioned, also new technologies have come online. How are you integrating those things? And what additional data is required? So, what variables are included in the decision? It's rarely a single variable. Let's see, the interplay between sort of operations and policies, I mentioned that before. And then trade-offs between decisions. And so how do we weight the trade-off between decisions? So release or not is a binary here, but it's release or not, when, how much. Now you begin to see if you release a little bit more and incur slightly more damage, is that an acceptable level? Is the trade-off there an acceptable trade-off? And how does that impact your valuation?
Right, and how do you run through those scenarios to do the trade-offs on loss of property, loss of lives, you know, and the risk of the confidence you have in the data and taking preemptive measures and then find out you didn't really need to do it versus not taking action and having more catastrophic loss.
Yeah.
Complicated value chain.
So with the 1 minute sign, I would ask if there are any questions then for us, or Pat, if you had anything else.
You know, I think the last thing we talked about in terms of the complexity or questions, unanswered questions or issues raised was the kind of really the complexity and the authority chain of who makes that decision with federal players, private operators, local government, all these. Is it clearly defined who's making decisions where, and is the data, the information products getting to them in a usable fashion so they can apply that to make an informed decision? Questions?
Okay.
We're done.
Thank you very much. Right on time. Thank you. Thank you, Group 2. All right, so we'll go ahead and go to Group 3.
I might be able to see it. So my name is Steve Thur. I'm from NOAA, and I am speaking on behalf of Group 3. We addressed Earth observations for harmful algal blooms, so microscopic plant-like organisms that can make toxins, both freshwater and marine. So what we decided to do is focus our value chain on a derived product, which is an early warning forecast. So basically letting folks know in advance of the likelihood of a harmful algal bloom appearing in a certain location. So moving upstream from that point in the value chain, we had various models that were necessary to run based upon data that was coming from various sources. Some of that was primary data collected for the purposes associated with the forecast from in situ monitoring or satellite observations. Some of that was information that was produced for other purposes that feed into the models, hydrodynamic information to move pixels around in space and time. Moving downstream, we spent most of our time talking about what happens after the product is produced. So who is benefiting and how can we value those benefits. A couple of the major consumers of early warning forecasts for harmful algal blooms are drinking water treatment operators. So they need to know when to ramp up protective measures to keep our drinking water system safe. A few years ago, Toledo had to shut down for 3.5 days. When you have a medium-sized city with no drinking water, that gets headlines. Aquaculture and wild fishery harvest industry are also big consumers of information about the early warning for harmful algal blooms. Municipalities, they're responsible for addressing recreation, so beach closures or posting of signs. And then there are many recreational operators. So charter boat fishers are a big category in a particular location. We talked a lot about Western Lake Erie. And then there are a couple of other operators that we talked about, a couple of other consumers. One are general recreation users in the public sphere, and that has human health impacts, but it can also have impacts to the family dog. So if the dog's playing on the beach, toxins are high enough, the dog can die, humans probably aren't. What's the value of the loss of Fido? We recognize that at that level of user of the information, there were still more downstream benefits. So taking drinking water treatment operators as an example, they can, with this early warning system that's based on the observations, optimize their treatment of the water. So they can add additional chemicals, they can switch supplies in certain instances, they can choose to shut down to prevent human health impacts. And so there is an economic benefit to the treatment plant operators, many of whom are municipal entities. So they are members of the public. They're not private entities. They're avoiding human health impacts that could have occurred but for the early warning system. Certain others, like aquaculture industry, they have an opportunity to harvest early if they're aware of an onset of a bloom, and what they're avoiding is human health impacts or a potential recall of their product. And so one of the challenges, jumping around on the questions behind me, is defining the counterfactual in our situation. So what would have occurred but for the early warning forecast that's based upon the Earth observations is sometimes a very difficult thing to define. And if you can define it, how do you quantify the necessary inputs to value the Earth observations? So you may be able to say if they didn't have an early warning forecast, they'd have to do this. They'd have to close beaches prematurely, or they'd not close them, and how many health impacts would we have in that situation? That was one of the challenges that we discussed quite a bit. The data sources are challenging in a couple of ways. One of the things we discussed was the smaller number of consumers of the early warning forecast, the easier it is to get the data. So if you have a drinking water treatment plant, you pretty much know who to go and ask. If you're asking for how many recreational trips were affected by a beach closure, you may have to ask 100,000 people that visited this county in a particular year. And so there are some aspects of the value chain that would be more readily accessible for secondary data collection, harvesting, and others would require primary data collection. In conjunction with this discussion, we talked about understanding why we're doing the value chain. And it may not be necessary for us to fully value this to meet our needs. So if the human health impacts of avoided illness by ensuring the drinking water treatment plants are fully optimized, that may be sufficient, even if you don't value the improvements to recreation or the avoided loss of dog years or something along those lines. Talking about a couple of the additional challenges with the value chain. Near the end of our discussion, we talked about this is a static look at current benefits produced by Earth observations. So harmful algal blooms are a societal problem. If we're good, we take steps so that the bloom goes away. So what's the value of Earth observations that today is being used to produce a forecast that saves human lives or reduces morbidity, but 10 years from now the bloom goes away, perhaps because we brought attention to the issue through the production of the forecast? What's the value of the Earth observations over time in a situation where there are no more health impacts because we've addressed the source of the problem? So that was, I guess, a question left unanswered. And then one of the last challenges that I haven't touched on is the challenges of the data sets, specifically if we've got the information for certain user groups or downstream benefits in the current situation or the counterfactual. And so for us, we were focused on the value of an early warning system. So for any harmful algal bloom, we either had an early warning system or we didn't. We have one or the other, and we've got to figure out what the counterfactual is. And do we have the data? So do we know how many human health impacts were avoided because we have an early warning system? We might know how many there were if we didn't have the system. We might have known how many we had years before we produced the system, but we don't know what we would have had today without the early warning system. And so the variety of impacts and the users of the early warning system complicate the production of the counterfactual and the derivation of or identification of the data we need. I've got 3 minutes left, and I think I'm done. Team.
Show a picture.
Oh, we've got a picture. How do I show a picture? I don't know how to show a picture. We've got a picture. So this is our vision of how we're going to communicate the value of Earth observations. Wait for it. It's a good picture. So there it was. Did you see it all? There we go. So we've got a happy dog along with a youth on the shore with some fishermen in the background. There's no hab because we've solved the problem because of Earth observations. And so you've got a happy scene right here. There's no green water. There's no dead fish on the beach. This is what we're striving for, and Earth observations get us there.
Can I add to our, please, not to our picture, just something that I learned from our process. We've been talking about value chains for a day and a half, and one thing that actually Jeff, I'll credit Jeff with this, came up with is we really should have phase 1, phase 2 value chains and come up with what are all the impacts, really what we might call as a diverging exercise before, we very quickly, because we had an hour, focused in on health impacts. And then as we got towards the end, we said, well, this is kind of a hard one. Maybe we should have looked at some of the others in more detail. So spending that time to really think, what are all the impacts? And then starting to detail sort of phase 2, what's that value chain look like? What's that data? I think we learned a lot just from the process of what we could analyze for the value of information from this exercise, and gave me a lot of insight for this activity for any number of applications.
I just wanted to say that I think in this kind of instances that you were examining, that one of the concerns also or values can be not so much as the timing of when to close something or when to suspend activities, but when to resume them. And I think that can carry a lot of monetary impact. All those businesses, the operations of the water plant. When is it safe to reopen it, and when is it safe to open the beaches and to allow those businesses that rely upon that income to resume their activities?
I think one of the things I didn't address at all, I didn't even gloss over it, was what is the value of public confidence in your government so that your drinking water is safe. So if your drinking water is not safe, you may choose to go out and buy bottled water. Or if your beach is safe for your kids to recreate at. Even if there aren't going to be human health impacts because your kids may not have asthma, there's a value in knowing that your government is keeping you safe. And that can have long-lasting impacts beyond the specific instance of a particular bloom. And we talked about the very real value there, but the very difficult challenge of estimating its size.
All right, well, thank you, Group 3. Round of applause. I will go ahead and, who's presenting for Group 4?
All right. So yes, trust transaction costs. Flint, with their water situation. Trusting in the for supply of water. All right, so a quick question for the audience. Does anybody know about Hammurabi's Code of Laws? Raise your hands. A couple people. Somebody want to fill in the group? First law. First laws? Yeah, some of the first codified laws in the world. And likely this will be just as impactful. So please do pay attention.
This better be good.
Oh, it's amazing. So our value chain was, of course, energy and mineral supply, mitigating, managing, and avoiding impacts of shortfalls on the economy. Like everybody else, one of our first challenges was how do we narrow this down into something we can address within the time period. And so we had a lot of folks with different expertise in the group, and we noodled on a few things. We looked at solar. We were thinking about what about traditional, some of the more fossil fuels. How do we use sensors for those? Can we build in, if we're doing things like the rare earth elements that are used in a lot of new technologies? Thanks for attention. A lot of new technologies. Can those be figured into our value chain? But quickly we realized we have an hour. We need to get this done. So we selected wind farm as our energy source, and wind farm siting specifically as the application of our sensory data. Now that is not the end user. That is our final product as a wind farm siting information. And then who's using that? And so we went first there to look at municipalities, industrial consumers, other industries. This would be sort of like maritime. If you're make sure your shipping lanes or your fisheries, everybody's on the same page. Investors investing in the project, regulators, citizens, those who will be using the electricity, and of course energy transmission and the energy supply. Those would be our end users there. So working backwards, our observation platforms, a lot of it was going to be satellite, but there are certainly sensors such as drones, some tower sensors, Tom had mentioned that some sensors are a little more expensive if they're going to be fixed on the ground, and so thus mobile sensors might be a more cost advantage. Our data that's going to come from these sensors, meteorological data, wind climatology, terrain information, those are going to be our large sources of data. Analysis that is going to come out of that could be, and folks are going to have to help me with definitions on these, cadastre, terrain analytics, terrain analysis, and these aren't necessarily types of information, the NIMBY, environmental and political, but these are things that are going to be affecting how people perform their analyses and how people frame their analyses. And so one of the other groups is talking about sort of the socio-political landscape, and this is the same thing. How are people defining the problems from a social or political standpoint? And that's going to determine, of course, how the analysis is conducted. So ideally, coming out of this analysis is some sort of a mapping product, a terrain map, other sorts of mapping products that can be used to identify where wind farm siting can occur, where the wind farms would be sited. Other final products coming out, so it's not only siting, but also decisions. This kind of, we're dealing in information and the value of information, and certainly decisions are a product, and those have a value in and of themselves. And also trade-off analyses. If you're siting a farm somewhere, what are your opportunity costs? What's being lost by putting it there? What's being gained? So we also want to talk about the value added. So what is the value add of this whole process? And so basically we have an existing process. You can site a wind farm. You don't have to use sensory data to do that. So what is it that this data is going to provide, is going to make better here? It's going to make better here. There's a more technical definition than that, I'm sure. So first, improving land cover mapping. You're going to get a broader area with some remote sensing, more accurate data. You're going to get trend data over time, and also morphology, wind flow data that we're going to get, that the sensors are going to be able to provide you. And if I'm getting any of this wrong, group, just jump in and say so. And again, the long-term data. And the actors that would be using, and not using this data, but the value added to specific actors. So marine spatial planners, if you're siting your wind farms offshore, for example, this would be folks planning plan sea routes. But how do you plan your wind farm around existing sea routes, around existing fisheries, recreation spots? Information to regulators. This is also going to be citizens. So the information to regulators. And we use really, this is fairly disjointed as it is, but I'm going to step back a little bit more. But we have politics and regulators, if you can see, with a ton of dots and dashes up there, because really that impacts differently in all the processes. We just wanted to highlight, we want to represent that is throughout the process, and that we're not specifically addressing that in our value chain along the way. But we certainly do recognize that that's a major driver. So again, citizen engagement, talking about the value of this data, increased citizen engagement. If you can actually get the citizens at the end, the people who are going to be engaged, either consuming the energy or having the wind farm built in their neighboring property, having them understand the process, having them understand the transparency by which the government goes through a decision to site a wind farm there, or to grant permits to an industrial partner to put that there. There's going to be better evidence for that decision and better transparency. So it's sort of a win for the citizenry. And value added also for investors. Certainly reduced uncertainty, reduced risk, bless you. You're going to get better informed decisions, more innovation, because you're creating more data, you're getting it out to more people. So you're building, in effect, a marketplace. So that increased access to data, you're going to be boosting innovation. And that's going to be a huge value add at the end of the chain. All right, so some of the issues and challenges that we had, there are different types of rationality. We all assume that everybody is using perfectly rational, we don't always assume that, but in an ideal world, this is a perfectly rational chain with perfectly rational people, but we all know it's either bounded rationality, if you're familiar with political science, or with Herbert Simon's satisficing, just kind of we make decisions as best we can, or what's politically expedient at the time. This is not a cost-benefit analysis, so a lot of the valuations we're putting in here, we're not trading these off against anything else. We're not saying what if. We're not doing the counterfactual. A couple of the groups mentioned counterfactuals. We don't have that in here either, so that's a drawback there. Also, this is for planning purposes. The scenario we put forward is a planning value chain. This is not necessarily an operational value chain. They can be tied together, or they can be linked, but this is planning, and so you're going to get different values and different outcomes depending on that. This also speaks to the power of language. Again, we're talking for more the political and social aspect. Is even if we're providing information to the ultimate consumers, the citizens at the end, is everybody speaking the same language? Is everybody understanding from the same point of view the opportunities and the challenges, and they're able to take advantage of this? It sounds, just from wind siting, but wind farm siting, but there's a lot of factors in play there. And lastly, we have some of the other challenges here. A clear picture of economic analysis. How do we communicate the actual value? How do you get past this value chain to real numbers? That sort of tied into our ideas for cost-benefit analyses. A mix of sensors is needed. How do we understand that we've got the right mix of sensors in this value chain? Also, another challenge is acquisition of data from the private sector. Who has access to that data? Do we have a level playing field in terms of how we're using that data? Two cultural areas, NIMBY and banana. So NIMBY, not in my backyard, and banana, Tom?
Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody.
So these are very real challenges to how we get infrastructure projects done. I think that there's a few more, but we're kind of out of time, so we'll wrap it up there. Any last comments that I missed? Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you for the good work, Group 4, and we'll go ahead to Group 5.
Okay, this is me briefing with a lot of help from my team. Our value chain was going to be on the effect of natural disasters on transportation systems, economy, safety, mobility. For some variety, we picked 2 natural disasters. We picked a volcanic eruption producing a lot of ash with an impact on air travel. Specifically, we were thinking of the 2010 eruption of Eyjafjallajökull in Iceland that caused so much havoc with European air traffic. And then we also picked Hurricane Sandy that hit New England pretty hard. To bring this down to something manageable within an hour, we very much narrowed it down to the volcanic eruption's effect on air travel and Sandy's effect on the subway system in New York City. We used basically the same value chain as Group 4, but we started by, we started by identifying who is the end user of the information that we're trying to derive. In the case of volcanic ash, we picked DHL, the package delivery service, noting that airlines can carry both goods and passengers. So in this case, this value chain could actually be split into 2 different end users. We also approached this knowing there are challenges with value chains being tiny parts of huge 3D meshes. So we began at the end. We want a good value product of how can DHL get their package to where they need to go on time? What can they use? What can we get for them that allows them to do that? And how can we get passengers either out of harm's way or to their destinations safely? Then once we determined that, we started at the other end and defined what kind of data we needed. And let's see, we also went through and polled everybody in our group as to what the top 3 data data things would be. And it was interesting because I approached this as a scientist. It's like, you need the seismology, you need the lightning detections, you need the infrasound. And I really wasn't thinking about it as a value as an economist. So the economists came in with theirs and I came in with mine. But we all agreed that the top three would be ash cloud forecasting, and the USGS does this. We have a good model called Ash 3D, but it is not without its shortcomings, as we'll see later. The value of air traffic activity, the metrics of it, how many people are passing through the area that you're concerned with, how many goods are passing through the area you're concerned with. And what's the other top one? Okay, and they were tied between what is actually in the air that's affecting the aircraft, what are the event threat thresholds, but what concentration of ash do you have to really worry about? Because they're now doing studies where they are showing that you can fly an airplane through a very dilute ash cloud and it won't hurt it. If you fly an airplane through a regular ash cloud, you can flame out all 4 engines and cause it to crash into the ocean, which we don't want to do. So the uncertainty for volcanic ash on air travel is when you have a model showing airspace you should avoid, what's the uncertainty with that? How good is that model? How far around do you really need to take the plane, loading it up with extra fuel, which will cost the airline extra money? So we note in pink here other events or data that feed into ours. So in terms of data, we have the ones I just mentioned. We also have satellite, ground-based instrumentation, and atmospheric models that go into that. They go into running of an ash model. The ash model relies on NOAA weather models, which way the winds are blowing, where's the ash going to go. From that, we derive ash cloud vectors. We put that out through the FAA. The FAA uses it for decision support to divert air traffic. Then they have an operation decision report. Well, that's where to direct the air traffic, and that feeds into airline operations. I think I'll go. The group have any other comments on the ash and airway? I think I'll go into Hurricane Sandy. So we have the passengers on the subway are the ultimate users. They need to know if it's safe. The Port Authority is the authority that's going to be directing the passengers as to what to do. Then we go back to how do we know the hurricane's going to hit? Where it's going to hit, that's the imagery that NOAA uses to do the track. We also have storm surge models once we know the tide and the wind speed of the hurricane. That's dependent upon hydrologic models feeding into that. That gives you a flood warning. That feeds into subway operations. And how the subway operations go when there's a flood warning for them depends upon if they have certain mitigation factors like pumps and, what was the other? Have they put sandbags around the entrances? I think there was something else too. The Port Authority, I guess this is New York City, is the ultimate regulatory authority that determines what to do, and the beneficiaries are the passengers. The challenges for both of these, especially for the subway, are understanding the delta. So I have to go back, and we understand that for each value chain, there is a chain with the information and without, and that difference is what we really need to convey. So the challenges, the top three, are how we communicate that so that the end users can understand it and decision makers can understand that. And there's all sorts of subtopics underneath communication. How we understand that delta with and without. How can we have a good understanding of it or derive a good understanding of it so that we can communicate that? And then the temporal aspect. How fast can we get these warnings to people? That's sort of more of, I guess, an inherent model and data gathering challenge to communicate. So we also have uncertainties in the models that we use. There's always built-in uncertainties, but the point was made that as you go through this chain and you add more information, you are increasing the certainty of what you're dealing with, even though some parts of your chain, like ash models, may have an inherent uncertainty to them. You are gradually building up more and more certainty about the event to warn your customers about. In terms of Data and info, I was thinking like the scientist. The economists were thinking like economists. We need surge and flood forecasts, imagery for tracking ash clouds and hurricanes, infrastructure mapping, what is the event going to hit? Passenger loading, we need to know how many passengers are flying through airspace or using subways, cost of potential losses, response resources, what resources can be mobilized in a particular event. And, well, I think the rest kind of fall under the others. The challenge is, what always usually throws a monkey wrench into response efficacy is human behavior. You know, are they going to try to, if the subway's going to flood, are they going to try to exit the subway the same way they came in, which is the dangerous way? Integrating forecasts, what do we mean by that? People. Weather and climate. Well, skipping that. Response prepositioning. You know generally that volcanic eruptions and hurricanes are coming. What kind of resources can you put in place ahead of time that would help make these value of information chains better, more effective? Obtaining data from local and external jurisdictions. So sometimes if you need to know the impact of something for your value study, can you get that data from, if you're a Fed, can you get that data from state and local jurisdictions? And even in an event like a big subway system that covers many jurisdictions, are you able to get that in time? The unanswered questions are, what can the future projections hold for these value chains? How can we do them and improve on them in the future? How well can we expand them? How big is the system of concern? What did we mean by that?
So, thinking about it not just as a linear, but as a web, how, so it was brought up how wide does it expand? How wide does that web expand? And how many feedback loops kind of play?
And also the style of value chains. Is this basic one the best one for this particular topic? And finally, what is the value to the users? You know, are we giving them what they really need to see and make decisions on? That's all I have. Anybody?
I will add one thing. I think you did a very good job of explaining a complex discussion that we had here. The temporal issues we had some additional discussion on, and I'm looking at the subway operations on the bottom value chain that we had. And we talked about the differentiation between the immediate kind of changes in putting sandbags out and effectively placing pumps as floods occur and things of that nature. And then there's the longer term planning. How can we create some kind of mitigation measures in advance of storms and thinking about them for a longer term perspective? So that temporal issue is very important, that we have two opportunities. One is long term, and then something at the point of the disaster occurring, and how do we respond immediately to that.
And I think what this exercise has done, it's really made me try to turn my mind more to thinking like an economist. It may take a while, but I'll get there.
Thank you. Thank you, Group 5, and thank you all to all of our presenters for being willing to do that. And now we've got until about 15 minutes just for open questions. I know there may have been questions and we had to get through each presentation, so if you have questions for the other groups or questions you want to pose to the group in general, or if you would just like to share some of the takeaways that you got from the experience of going through this and then sort of seeing what everyone else went through, I'll turn it to you. Okay, Rudy?
I want to ask the same question that Emily asked our group at the very beginning. Did anybody look at these as actual systems valuing something that's actually happening right now, or were you thinking about prospective or hypothetical things that could happen if the system was rolled out.
I'll make one comment on that. I think we were looking at a combination, which I imagine most people were, but one in particular that we talked about was, at least in the US, the national water model, and how the national water model, as it's just becoming operational, how that could be used to improve the value, the resolution, the value, and input on forecasting. So we're trying to do some blending of what exists now and how it could help make things better in a broader system going forward.
We took a slightly different approach because we actually identified use cases that are historical, and you could go back and look at the data. So whether it was the eruption in Iceland impacting European traffic, or whether it's Hurricane Sandy, it allows us to go through the value chain and do a real quantitative assessment. And we actually talked about, how do we do that and some of the other things. So yeah, I think that was another alternative.
Just adding to that, what Jay was saying, one of the things that came out of this is a good way of doing an attribution to specific inputs. So you can work out, ultimately working your way back, you can work out how much imagery, say, make an estimate of how much it might have contributed to this against all the other ones. The other thing is that once you've done that, then you can think about incremental improvements and what that might mean to the delta. So you can take your existing, but then you can think about the marginal changes you might make, where you might make those marginal changes to improve that outcome.
That's an interesting question because before we really tapped Carl, our program was looking at doing this. I was trying to ease my scientists into it, and we have a congressional liaison and a budget liaison for our mission area in the USGS. And we asked them their advice on how to go about this, and they said you should do something that happened in the past. You should do an eruption that happened in the past and project it to the impact on people and infrastructure of today. But some of us also thought some of these volcanoes are capable of much more. What is the balance? Should we do a theoretical, or should we do something that happened in the past and then put a caveat on it, but it's capable of much worse? So I'd be interested in hearing what advice people here have, because we didn't ask economists and social scientists.
I think it's great if you can go back to previous events. In my experience, the data is not always available for those previous events, and that makes it much more difficult, particularly if you go to the developing world. The data just isn't available. The other thing is looking backwards, that maybe it's something that's totally innovative, that you are looking to solve, and therefore there isn't a past event to go back and look at. So, you run a danger maybe of cutting out things that will be the killer app, if you like. The other thing I wanted to move on to maybe was to think about linear value chains and network value chains. I think that these systems are so complex that having linear value chains, you lose a lot in doing that. I think the challenge is not making. You could have a value chain that covered the whole of this room if you were to look at too many use cases together. So the trick is to have something that's manageable, have a series of those, and then work out the linkages between them as part of the exercise. But these things aren't linear. That would be.
I'll answer the question. And I think for group 3, we were basing our value chain on existing products.
Yep, and I want to add to that because I think what Vic brought up is two different things, past and hypothetical. So where we looked at data, our information product is existing, but you could certainly extrapolate that to future incidents. So if you could project a future volcano eruption, if you could predict the impacts of a future volcano eruption, I think that's great. And I think probably the economists would agree that as long as you could say this is what might happen, but you were using an information product that already existed, so that you could figure out, well, how would this be used? I think that's it's interesting what Group 1 took on, what might be needed, and I think that's important as we think about, what is the next information product that our agencies are putting out there, and how might it be used and improve people's lives. And so I think that's interesting that you all took on that challenge.
It was put to us as a matter of credibility. They're going to think you're scientists making things up if you predict some big mega eruption. And if you can start with something that actually happened, and from your geologic mapping, we have a lot of past events to draw on for this. If you can start with that and then maybe project, that might be more credible to the audience of decision makers, and that's what we're aiming for, is decision makers. So, who don't know volcanology.
I think one important issue to think about as we look forward at the ex ante or ex post analysis, looking forward to what will happen or might happen as far as future benefits, and as opposed to understanding what happened, is in many cases what we're considering is not so much the history of how information was used, although that's very important. The case we're making, what we're trying to understand is how can information going forward create societal benefits? And if we can't make the case looking forward, we run the risk of having a situation where, well, we've solved the problem. 5 years ago, we saved X amount of dollars, we created these great societal benefits, and it doesn't explicitly then make a case, or doesn't explicitly consider the question of what is to be gained by having future information, future data that could help answer the question. So I think that's an important issue. With that said, I think it is critical that we do retrospective examinations at some points in order to anchor whatever we're looking at going forward in reality. And the idea is that we have to make sure what we're looking at has some relevance to potential real events that have occurred and real value. So it is a balance, but I don't want to sort of suggest that it's okay just to look backwards. We do need to look forwards if we're looking at evaluating where do we go from here, how do we make decisions for future planning, which is, I think, a major purpose of this value of information effort.
In doing these studies, it seems to me you could take one of the previous events and cast it into today. So a volcano has the same characteristics. So you could overlay on top of that what the current situation is, and then look forward if this happens again. It doesn't have to be, 500,000 years from now.
No, that's our original plan. Take an event that happened in the past and what's its impact on the current population and infrastructure.
Instead of trying to take it back to when the event happened.
Well, yeah, it's like in volcanoes, the past is the key to the present. We know at minimum what it's going to do based on what it did in the past. The thing is, can we project some huge event that it's capable of, but that didn't happen in the past?
Well, we actually got into that a little bit with Mammoth Lakes. We were told that the volcano went off about every 500,000 years, give or take 50,000, but that didn't stop the Geological Survey from making a hazard announcement.
I was interested by what Group 4 said about the need for public engagement, and so I'm part of a succinct working group on participatory modeling, and we think a lot about participatory modeling and participatory planning, and I think that comment was right on target. And I think having, so when I think about what's the value of thinking about value chains, I think as opposed to letting things happen organically, I think that actually thinking about this in a structured way, like we've been doing today, can help us create opportunities, for public for participatory planning and participatory modeling that we wouldn't have otherwise, and thereby really get public understanding that we wouldn't otherwise. So.
Actually, that comment inspired. Well, I was about to say something similar, but on a slightly different slant, in terms of participatory modeling of these value chains. But so I'm going to take inspiration from something called the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit that was advanced under President Obama's Climate Action Plan. And a Climate Resilience Toolkit is a website set up, actually run primarily by NOAA, to document use cases of how communities prepared. So going to Group 2's classification of whether you're preparing or you're responding to an impending climate disaster. The Climate Resilience Toolkit was primarily a tool, a use case actually. It documented the steps. There was a 5-step protocol, kind of maps, not really quite, but kind of maps to the value chain process here. But it was used to document how communities prepared themselves to withstand the impacts of future climate change. And so it occurred to me that the value chain framework that you have out here, and going back to sharing approaches that you have used to model your value chain, it would occur to me that it would be useful to have such a clearly defined framework, use that framework to document people's approach to that value chain that you have in mind, but to put it in a place that is publicly accessible for folks to pull down and modify the value chain for specific purposes. So if you come from the coding world, you think of it as a parallel to GitHub, where coders, programmers put a code up on GitHub, and then some other enterprising person will come along, pull down that code, modify the code, and they call it fork it, but you create a different version of it. But again, you put that modified code back up for the rest of the community to use. So if you think GitHub and you think US Climate Resilience Toolkit and you think the value chain framework as a way to promulgate a solution, this is what you have. You have a value chain is the documentation of a traceable solution. Your value chain is actually introducing this very important concept of traceability. And somebody, I think it was Group 5, talked about transparency of decisions. Traceability ties very closely to transparency. And so I would encourage folks to think about, is there a way, somebody's got to fund it, some federal agency has got to fund it, but to document and make public these value chains for other people to download and utilize.
And then we'll have time for one last comment over here. We'll go too close to that. Oh, sorry.
Just chaining up on this comment, I have the feeling that this is what we are trying to do is going through seeking for a structured organization of presenting use cases, for instance. And I picked up a comment that Trudy made yesterday about the need to pass frame the messages because they can be more effective. So having a standardized way of describing the use cases through value chains and maybe shared on the net, that could be a way to frame the messages. Is it what you were meaning with your statement?
Well, yes, and more. So if you use, I can yell or I can use that. I'm okay with either one. Using a value chain to communicate the value would be more like a communication platform, right? So if you have a standard method, the way you're going to be communicating something, you have a set framework of the way that the message looks, the content areas that are there, so somebody knows what they're seeing and they're experiencing the same thing. You think of like a website, you know how a website works. There's certain webs that you go to. So the value chain may be a good way of having a framework or a platform for communicating the value. The framing might be the way you talk about the content that's in there, talking about societal needs or benefits or the sort of solution that you're providing or the issue that you're providing a solution to, if that makes sense. So it's more about, you know, a platform and consistent way of doing it, and then how you talk about it might be the framing. You're providing a benefit to society, or you're solving a complex problem that other people can't solve, or you're preparing for the future. Those might be frames with it.
All right, so one more comment, and then we'll break for 15 minutes. So our final comment.
It seems to me, and I know Jamie's familiar with this, but one way of, a means of establishing a value in relation to the hazards side of things was, I mean, there are a couple of well-documented incidents where jetliners flew through volcanic clouds, all engines shut down, the planes were going down. They were just fortunate that they were able to restart the engines. In one case in Alaska, the flight lost 14,000 feet of elevation before it was able to do so, and it was really just through the grace of God that they were able to land that aircraft. And it's pretty easy to put a value on you know, the number of lives that would have been lost, and as well as dollar values, and there's some powerful arguments that can be made there. I think similarly, perhaps in relation to the lost Malaysian airliner and the amount of money that was spent searching for that, and had you had an appropriate system, a satellite system in place, the amounts of money that could have been saved. But one other thing, I just wonder a little bit, and I think maybe it's worth thinking about in the course of pondering some of these questions, is that, I mean, I think approach this from the viewpoint that, hey, this is information. It's information that allows you to make more informed decisions, and that's a good thing. Not everybody will look at it that way. There are politicians who will look at this and think, what you're doing is not informing my decision space, you're constraining it. And I think that's something to think about, because there's a lot of people in decision-making positions who don't necessarily want that information to constrain the decisions that they might want to make.
Pushing all right politics at the top of our...
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for your good work and your contributions. Let's regroup at 2:35. Is that okay? So we went a little bit long. So take a 15-minute break and be ready to go. 2:35, we'll be doing the guidance document scoping. Thank you. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the, excuse me, the guidance document scoping, and we'll have Monica and Carl lead this for us. And Denna will be typing, which is a very nerve-wracking job to be typing on a screen like this. So thank you, Denna, for doing that. Yeah.
Please excuse typos in advance.
Okay, I can start. So we are in our last hour of our workshop. I think it was very successful. And now I think we talked about what products we want to have from this workshop yesterday, and so now it's the time for us to start thinking of how can we use all this good discussion we had here yesterday and today, and use that to communicate the value of Earth observations and communicate all the work we have been doing. We thought about a document, but I think we should open up for discussion, and the whole idea of this last hour is really to just brainstorm and discuss what you guys envision would be a great product for us from this workshop to really communicate with the community out there. So the first question is always, when I talk about communication, who do you want to communicate with? What would be your target audience? We can have multiple. We can have one major target audience. So I just want to open up and see. I don't know if Carl wants to say anything about that. Or
I'm trying to see if I can get a second mic.
Just get this one.
Anyway, I just was going to add to what Monica said. This is really the bridge between, we've been talking about activities here in this room for the last day and a half, and we've had a really, I think, stimulating conversation. And now we're sort of getting to the point where we need to build a bridge between what we talked about the last day and a half and moving forward, moving out of this room back to our workplaces, back to the real world. And so the discussion in the next hour will be, how do we most effectively build that bridge? How do we synthesize what we've talked about moving forward? And how do we develop some kind of communications product and future and additional next steps, work that we're going to be doing going forward? So this is very much the connection between what we've talked about the last day and a half and moving forward. And so, as Monica was saying, I think the question we want to ask first is, we were thinking in terms of some kind of a report, a proceedings document perhaps, about what we've had. And then Monica suggested, and I think it was an excellent suggestion, maybe we shouldn't tell them what we're going to do. Maybe we should ask for ideas. So we want to start with that question. We want to get some ideas from you on what you see as an appropriate communications product or products from this event. So it's in your hands.
So the mic's behind you now. You guys can use one of those.
Oh,
Don't go
okay.
too far, but.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. One thing I think is kind of interesting is I work with a lot of end users, and they don't know that it's important to communicate that what data sets they're using and to whom they should communicate that to. They just know, oh, I made this decision, I'm moving on with my work. They don't know that reporting back, in essence, like, thank you for this data, Earth Observation Agency. They don't know that that's hugely valuable. So one potential audience is, how do we even educate end users? And I think, I work with a lot of commercial entities from time to time, and they wouldn't even know who to contact with that feedback. So it's just an idea of, how do we educate the folks who are actually using it to even say, hey, I used your data for this.
In our working group number 5, we had a discussion about who are the targets, who are the users. And we came to the conclusion that there's the operator who has the pain, because he has the responsibility to do it. And then there's the user who has the advantage of the information. And to give you an example, on an airline, the delays that come from weather, the operator feels the pain as much or more, but the passenger ultimately is the beneficiary of having the information available, to having the streamlining. And the last element was the data. So I think there are multiple targets, and we ought to think about those targets which are in the decision-making path, which is the airline in that case, and those in the beneficiary path, I think is the word we used, because they're different.
Carl, I took time out from this day and a half to go and sit with Steve Ramage and the communications team, or communications group that is just being formed within GEO. And it was interesting. They were saying, we're all dressed up with nowhere to go. We've got nobody to tell us stories. And both Steve and I said, we've just been sitting in a session where we've been talking about those stories. So to me, there is a very quick win here, possibly this week, which is to tie up with that group, because they have a need, we have a need, and we've both got things to bring to the party. And every time I've sat in one of these sessions, we come out at the end of it saying our really big problem is not, we can sort out maybe the issues to do with which are the best methodologies, okay? But what we don't have is strong skills around communications. And there was a group down the corridor there yesterday who have those skills. They're the professionals. Let's get together.
So a little bit different perspective. I think our public agency leadership, Earth observation providers need to have the information or the output we've decided in this workshop. Especially looking for, if we came up with some ideas about what data could be collected along the chain to understand our users. I think if we had any influence on collecting additional data that would help us do these value of information studies, that would be a huge contribution to this field.
And Emily, we do have a question on that very topic later in our progression here, near the end of the hour.
So keying off your suggestion of teaming up with communications, one potential target for a document like that could be actually the professional societies in town. And the reason why I say professional societies is that, so I'm one of those, I play at a science policy interface, and a lot of the professional societies, especially AAAS, I mean, there are always bunches of AAAS fellows floating around here, and things like AGU, American Geophysical Union. Now, they are in a position to, for example, convince their constituency, whether that be members of the public or decision makers in any given level of government, that there is a value in thinking about value of information. And that ultimately ties to, again, a role that the professional societies play in public policy. They have the gravitas, well, some of them have the gravitas and the freedom to go up to the Capitol Hill and stage briefings, for example. And so this comes on a separate, couple of years back, I was talking to a congressional staffer, because I was there actually talking about open data, right? And in two separate offices, I didn't ask for this, but two separate offices, the two different congressional staffers told me, they were, I wouldn't say which side of the aisle they were from, but these two staffers say to me, look, we support open data, and the reason why we support open data is because it helps us discover duplication in the government. And so they said, yeah, open data is great, we will support that. And actually it's a bipartisan issue. And so for the same reasons, if you think about value of information and helping us operate a more efficient government, I think it is also a bipartisan issue. But again, if you want to break through, I know agency folks like yourself cannot approach legislators without them inviting you. Your Office of Congressional Relations folks, yeah, they can have some conversation, but for most intents and purposes, a lot of federal employees cannot proactively approach members of Congress, but professional societies can. And so again, having a document that speaks to professional society leadership, especially those in public policy, I think might be a little bit, it might be worthwhile thinking about doing that. And so that the kind of wink, well, not quite really, but is that the professional societies, depending on which professional society you target this document to, they will occasionally help you champion for your agency's funding priorities. I mean, think GSA, right? Geological Society of America, and just a very specific one there.
He was first.
I see two steps here. One, I think the question is the communication, the report from this meeting, which I think is mainly aimed at our own stakeholders and convincing them that we can do something more by working together. And then the second step is, and I think we can bring the communications people in to guide us, but the second step is then building case studies, building the repository that we can then communicate on a much wider basis. So I think this report, for me at least, is our own constituencies, our own stakeholders. Maybe there are some additional organisations that we can reach out to try to bring into this this grouping, this community. but I think it's more a statement of intent and a recognition of what we can do as a group. But then let's be very clear on the second stage where we can, where our goal is to communicate much wider to politicians, to citizens, to the wider community about the benefits of the technology.
So I agree with Andy that it would be good to communicate with the communication experts. I am not a communications expert, but I do have the fortune of working with some in the Valuables Consortium, and I think that one thing that they would say, being put in the situation of understanding our target audience, is that we need to do an audience analysis. We did this within a already narrow set of audiences, which is the earth science and social science community. And we implemented surveys both online and for those workshops in which we were presenting. We passed out paper surveys asking what kinds of information are you interested in about valued information and what formats are the best for us to convey that information to you. And we got some interesting results. We thought social media might be an interesting and something that people would find useful. It turns out it's not. Which, this is mostly academics and scientists, so that's not surprising. But we also found that the webinars are really popular within this audience. And so, communications experts can provide you with, sometimes data-driven ways to target the right audiences and do so in the most effective manner.
So, Carl, Monica, for the sake of time, should we move on to one of the next points?
So, so I think we have a good spread of potential target audience now. But the other issue that we are trying to figure out what would be the best format for us to communicate, and that I think it depends on the audience. Once you define your audience, I think it'll be easier for you to figure out what are the formats. Initially, I just happened it could be a paper, could be a story map from Esri. It's recently we did one for NOAA with a value of the economic statistics related to the products and services that NOAA provides, and was extremely successful with leadership. Like even the secretary saw it. So it's a great tool to communicate. The story map. You mentioned the resilience tool. That is something that can be maybe leveraged, the idea of having a tool like that for maybe an interactive value chain exercise. That's another idea. Esri has been doing this.
Yeah, I had just mentioned at our table after you mentioned the resilience toolkit that we've been, working somewhat with Dave Herring's group, and then taking, because we build a lot of, say, common solutions, things that we see across the community that are repeatable, and then we'll work with them, build those, and then open source those applications. And we're building out some of those solutions that help implement step 1, step 2, step 3 in the climate resilience toolkit. So we're in that process now. But it's a big, broad, if we start working on building some of these solutions for, say, the flood aspect of climate resilience, then there's heat and there's all those. But we're started on that process, so maybe there's something that can be leveraged there.
One of the things we're going to be asking is who in this group is willing to participate going forward in developing some of these communications products. And we're going to try to put up a sheet of paper somewhere in the back that people can sign up. But what I would say is that's not going to be the only way people are involved. We reserve the right to sort of directly ask you as well. And because I think this is very important. And we don't see this participation as just a 2-day event, that this is something, it is a bridge to going forward in this area. a big question that we had, and that was discussed a little bit, but we wanted to sort of raise it for some discussion at the end of this meeting, relates to the rationale for doing value of information studies. Why is this so important? Why are we devoting 2 days to this in this period? Why has there been a geo-value community going back about 10 years that we've been addressing this? Why have some of you traveled far to participate in this and develop papers? What is the rationale for why we have why we need to understand the value of Earth observations? And this is not a question that's meant to be academic. It's what are we trying to accomplish? Are we trying to convince stakeholders of the importance of this? Are we trying to achieve funding? Do we see this to be potentially something that's required to better do our jobs of creating science information and Earth observations? We'd like to get some discussion on that topic if we could.
Oh, I think it's incredibly simple, actually. If you want to get a project justified these days, you have to have a good business case. And so therefore, you look in developed countries or in developing countries. In developing countries, in order to get in front of the Minister of Finance, you need some numbers. It really is as simple as that. And it's a worldwide thing. There's not enough commonality in terms of approaches, because if we did have common approaches, it would be less expensive to do that. At the moment, that money is being cut out of the amount that's available to spend on the project.
Carl just gave me a job, so.
Thank you, Andrew.
I just endorse what Andrew said, but there's another dimension which I find contrasting from this value chain analysis. At the moment, one of the big issues in my country is the governments want to know actually not only what it's worth, but where the employment is in the value chain. And we've just done it for space, and no one really quite understood what the small and medium enterprises were doing, for example, because there's a lot of innovation and industry issues around this as well. And the value chains help you understand what some of those industries are. And it's more important for not only for industry policy, but it's also important for the industries themselves in order to be able to make the case to their particular minister as to why they're important.
So if, as Carl mentioned, if you are interested in working on some of these deliverables, there's a fluorescent green sheet of paper where you can write your name, organization, and email. We also reserve the right to ask you, so just putting that out there.
So I just wanted to add that in addition to justifying budgets, what I would normally say prioritizing research needs, Anjali yesterday described it as sequencing, which I think is even better. Understanding how our Earth observations provide benefits and where we should focus our money now and next. And next is really, I think, something that we bring value to the table when we do that. Jeff or Jeff?
Give it to Jeff.
There you go. That's very helpful. Just very quickly, Alan had mentioned this, I believe, yesterday, and we passed over it. But what we've been talking about for a day and a half is a useful approach, I believe, for addressing certain kinds of questions. But there is another kind of related realm to this that we at NOAA have worked on to some extent, and I'm not sure what name Alan applied to it, but there is the notion of these industrial clusters that are understanding the industries that support the businesses and the networks of businesses that support this realm of activity. That's something that NOAA has done for the ocean observations, IUS systems, and they've done a recent study looking at what businesses provide direct and indirect support to that. And so that is another type of question that probably deserves some attention. And I work on a data set that NOAA produces on the ocean-based economy, and having a good understanding of what's in and not in those industrial clusters that make Earth observations possible is also useful information for making a case. I mean, it's nice to be able to say how many jobs are supported by this, and the kind of jobs and the kind of wages and so forth.
Okay, that was a nice lead-in. Thank you. Because I was also going to bring industry into the equation, because I mean I represent an industry network, and for us, I mean, these are marketing tools, and that's what they are for you as well. I mean, agencies trying to justify the budgets. For us, they're also trying to convince customers that there's a real value in what they can do, and a lot of our targets are the informed people inside companies that will then become a beacon to an amplifier inside there, and what we provide is a tool for them to convince their own management that there's value in what they're doing. So we're talking about marketing tools. So from an industrial perspective, it's not just about the community that is perhaps benefiting directly from jobs, but also from the communities, and this is part of our analysis where we go down the value chain, industries which are benefiting from the use of the satellite data and maybe improving their own performances, as part of the story that we're telling.
In case you don't see the one on the door, we're also going to pass one around, so if you're interested. Go ahead.
So from my perspective, I think you can hit multiple birds with one stone. And so I'm currently funding value of information studies because I want to justify growth in appropriations. So I want to demonstrate the value that I'm providing. But I'm also looking at it from the ability to answer the question, should we be doing this? So I know how much it costs to do something. What I'm trying to determine is there enough value, and how is that value distributed across society for the government to be in the appropriate situation to be doing this activity? Should we pass this along to an industry association? Should we pass it along to a different governmental agency at a state level, for instance? And so I'm using value of information at two different levels from where I sit. One is justifying growth in budgets, and the other is optimizing the existing resources to make sure I'm funding the highest priority activities.
Another slightly different reason why we should meet and talk and then go out to our respective circles and talk about these issues to other people, I think, is that there's an academic element to this where a lot of the methodologies to do this kind of work are still being developed. There is a lot of these methods that aren't currently well established in the academic literature, and so and I think one of the reasons why that is the case is that it's not a topic that's currently hot in academia, right? Economics, just like every other discipline, has topics that tend to get published in the reputable journals, and then if you're working on something else, it's sometimes difficult to get those things published. And VOI of information, value of information, I think, is one of those topics that it's hard for an academically minded person to, or if their career is based on academic achievements for promotion and whatnot, then the incentives aren't there. And so, but I think that can be changed if we have a large enough community pushing the importance of this and the policy relevance of what we do.
We need to demonstrate the value of information.
I apologize if I'm maybe repeating something that was said before. I was distracted for a little while. But it would seem to me that, satellites have been up for a period of time now, fairly lengthy period of time, and there were justifications written for the launches and putting those satellites in place, and we could look at, okay, what was the justification? What were the unanticipated benefits of launching those satellites? What did we get that we weren't expecting to get? And I suspect that's substantial, and that reasoning, that logic could be applied to the justification for subsequent those satellites. And can we quantify those unexpected benefits from previous satellites?
Of course, you've had to have done the VOI study of the previous mission in order to be able to do that. But the happenstance or serendipity and putting values on that, I think that's a very interesting research area. Obviously, if you go back to the first space missions and so on, you've got pens that worked in zero gravity and stuff like that. There's a lot of these kind of spillover stories. I'm not sure that we've actually done the spillover stories for Earth observation.
I'd like to step back as moderator and go into the mode as participant here. And I'd like to add to the idea that we're doing these value of information studies just to justify our work or to even prioritize our work. I believe there is a strong case to be made that we are able to do our job better if we understand where the value of Earth observations comes from. And I think this is important, that we think about this more broadly than just a justification or prioritization effort, in the sense that if we understand where value is coming from, how the Earth observations can be used, we can do our job better, and the Earth observations increase in value as we can tailor products to known needs, as we can identify gaps and try to fill gaps. I think the whole idea of value of information and understanding societal benefits not only helps us justify, not only helps us prioritize, but helps us increase the use and value of Earth observations, and I think that's very important. And I think my suggestion to our community is that we begin to emphasize that a little bit, that this is not just a program justification effort, and it is. I understand that, but I think that thinking beyond that will be helpful to us in what we're thinking, and will increase and has the very strong potential of increasing the use and value of Earth observations.
So I totally agree with you, Carl, and I think this relates to what I said earlier about the need for public engagement. And basically, my feeling is that as long as the public, which includes our funders for the most part, don't understand what we're doing or what the potential value of information is, they're not going to use it. And so, from my perspective, the main benefit of what we're doing is being able to convey in simple ways, maybe using story maps, or other types of venues for narratives. Yes, maybe some quantification of the economic benefits. But generally speaking, representing the value of information so that actually it can be used in policy making and in individual decision making. So, thank you.
I just want to challenge Carl a little bit. I understand where you're coming from, but I think it's important we understand our users, and if we understand how they use our information, we can tweak it to make it better. Do we have to know the economic values, and are those different?
I think that part of what I was suggesting is that understanding the value of information includes identifying users and knowing what the users need and how they use the information. It's not exclusively quantifying the value of information, but it's broadly understanding what is the value chain. How are Earth observations used? How do they create value? And implicitly from that, how can we create even more value by knowing this? So Emily, I think that you're agreeing with me more than challenging me.
And about finding the right narrative.
So for those who don't know me, my name's Christopher. I am actually working as a communications specialist in one of the offices at NOAA. And so I spent a lot of time this past year thinking about how do we communicate to a variety of audiences. And I think there's been a lot of awesome discussion that's been going on. So kind of just to pull some of it together is I like the idea of a story map because you can attach visuals with it. And I'd almost say or throw this idea out there of creating almost 2 case studies. So you can repurpose a lot of the discussions that you've had today and kind of hone in on, for example, what happened with a volcanic eruption and how did that play out at different levels of the chain, and then identify the audience that you're trying to reach and say, okay, well, after you do that assessment of how are our users using this information, then create an alternate case study and say, okay, well, what would happen if we didn't have this piece or we didn't have this piece? How might this play out? That might be getting at communicating the value that that information had in achieving that product. If you remove that from the situation, really show, okay, well, this piece wasn't here. How did this propagate out and what broke down in this system and what sort of impacts might that have had on it? So almost creating 2 case studies of a this went well scenario versus it didn't go well because this was missing sort of thing. Just something to kind of think about.
I think that the power of using the value chain approach to narrate about the use cases is also useful to understand the impacts of the data, also in a reverse way. I have an example of what would be the impact of a denial of service. What would be the impact of if we stop the service giving the data. This example is with the acquisition of the radar satellite that were used in the operational chain for the ship routing. There was the need to, we thought we would change the acquisition pattern because we need to cover this other community. So we couldn't ensure any longer the same coverage. And the users, they reacted immediately, saying, I know that would be an impact along all the value chain. And they used the value of information study that was done by Jeff, in fact, to communicate that we couldn't take this decision because it had such an important impact on their economy. So the message went really through, and using the value chain was useful for the whole public to communicate and to understand what would be the impact of not providing any longer the data.
I like that idea of using a narrative to kind of explain that value chain and make it more real and understandable for people. And I think we could get a lot of value out of that. I also just want to say there's a lot of reference to the story maps here, and not to put in a plug to come to our booth, but if you don't know what we're talking about, there are plenty of opportunities to interact with some of these, see what they are. I know at the US booth they're showing some of the new NOAA story maps and some others, and they're really very simple to put together. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to take the ideas, even maybe some of the sample value chains here, and put those into at least draft them up as story maps and let people play around with them and see if they're helpful. But there are opportunities to see them out in the exhibit area if you're kind of wondering what they are.
Yeah, I think that we're mixing two different things, right? One of them is sort of this method or process of the value chains for understanding what the values are and understanding the system of value flow throughout society, and the communication of the results of the value chain analysis, right? Because based on all those presentations that we saw yesterday, none of those value chains should ever be shown to anybody that you want to convince of something out there. They're entirely too complex. They're incredibly confusing. There are too many boxes and arrows. It needs to be taken and then turned into something digestible. And that's easy. That's where the story maps come in, that kind of thing. So I think that it sounds like everybody's agreeing these value chains are really cool. They work. There's discussion of how to put them together and that sort of thing. So everyone likes that. The next question is, as we've been talking about, how do you then take that information and create, as I was calling, the sort of quiver of information, right? The sort of, you have all these, there are targets that you need to communicate to, your communication target, and any one target may be receptive to a different frame or a different way of communicating. Which arrow do you pull out of the quiver to hit that target? Is it a story map, or an infographic, or an elevator talk, or whatever it might be? And then you create a value chain, and then you extract the information out of it and create 4 different messages from the same piece of information, and 4 different ways to communicate the same thing depending on who that target is.
Probably going to, the guy at the back, the communications guy, knows this already. You can classify decision makers in 3 ways. There are numbers people, and you give them spreadsheets. Okay, there are words people, and you give them papers like we've done traditionally. Okay, and then there are picture people, and you give them videos.
Right, so we've got about 15 more minutes on this. Are we getting where you two need to go? Ready to go to...
Then I can move the... Just see what...
That's,
Did you guys get it
Future directions?
Did you guys get this yet?
no, there's one above.
Are we going up more? You got it, Eric?
Method? Oh, we've done that, okay.
Yeah, we
that's it.
talk about the value chains, and yeah, I think we need to really, we have been talking about really the, if we want to,
the mic's right behind
you. Sorry. If we want to really make value chain a part of a process, make this, instead of ad hoc projects, make this something that is more, I'll say, sustainable, that you can have maybe one framework, one value chain that can be used multiple times. What are the future directions? What type of information, for example, we should be maybe thinking of collecting right now to improve the process of putting together a value chain? And I think Emily had a great question when she was challenging Carl. That is really one thing that I saw as commonality when we were having our discussion of value chains is, do we understand the decision-making process? Do we really know the people that are using the data, how they use it, and how they make the decision? So I just want to open up. I don't know if Carl wants to say anything, but James.
So coming back to why we need the value, I think that we're talking about money, and we're talking not about projects. We're talking about designing a sustained observing system. So by knowing the value of that information will guide us to design that observing system. That will be really important, particularly if you have a little bit more of detail to that value. If you specify, if you have the information with a certain accuracy or probability of being correct in a predictive sense, or a spatial and temporal coverage of that, what would be the value? So you can think about staging that value chain, and if you know everything, that's going to cost a lot, but the the extra information or value of that might not be that high. So having that information, a little bit more granularity to the value would be really useful for designing an observing system that is a sustained observing system that the stakeholders would like us to see. I think a little bit more granularity in that would be really useful.
This is kind of diffuse. I'm with the minerals program in the USGS, and I know that not too long ago I was not a participant in this, but they had a meeting about big data, and whatever that means. But there were a number of people from the Carnegie Institute that sat down with folks from the USGS. And it seems to me these guys from the Carnegie Institute, I'm told, were these incredibly high-level thinkers that are really involved with dealing with big data sets and looking how to manipulate those data sets and use them and interrelate them in ways that they haven't been utilized before. And by all accounts, that from what I heard, that it was this there was this palpable electricity in the room that was going on, and these guys were opening up their computers, and it seems to me a lot of what we're talking about here is how does the information that we might gain through these Earth observation systems, how does that leverage other forms of information? And conversely, how might those other forms of information leverage the information you obtain from the Earth observation systems? And the thought occurs to me that maybe there might be some value in convening some kind of a think session like that, and the Carnegie Institute might be a place to start to talk to some of those folks.
Just to very quickly key off that comment about big data. So there was a bunch of us in the room, maybe less now, but there's a bunch of us in the room who hail from this community called the Earth Science Information Partners, ESIP, and actually ESIP has a booth right at the exhibition hall. In fact, so the funders of ESIP are NASA, NOAA primarily, and the USGS. And next year at the ESIP winter meeting, which is in January, the theme of the ESIP winter meeting is actually on the socioeconomic value of data, I think, or something.
Yes.
Christine is the vice president of ESIP.
Great.
What is the theme again?
You got the theme. That's correct.
Socioeconomic value of data.
Yeah. Exactly.
ESIP.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, ESIP.
Well, and would ESIP be a place to convene a discussion on big data and pulling some of this together?
I'll let the vice president talk.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an appropriate place. It's a topic that comes up quite regularly. It's a Earth science, data, and informatics-minded group, but also has domain expertise and a number of different perspectives from industry to government to research. So, and of course, I mean, folks in this group would be welcome to come in January. It's in Bethesda, the second week of January, the 9th. I think it starts the 9th through the 11th. But anyway, big data topics, absolutely. And we are actually, I think Brian and I are in a session that we're convening regarding community resilience. And so looking at how what it looks like on the ground to be looking at case studies for community resilience from kind of mid-level cities, not massive cities, mid-level. And I was thinking, Brian, too, about your data to decision work as well, and had a thought to talk with you later about how this conversation fits into that. So I don't know if that's appropriate to share, but that's another thing that we're going through with ESIP too. So the thinking about how you are looking at the life cycle of data as it gets into decision and what repeatable workflows come out of that, and templates and patterns and things.
As we get to the end of this question, and we are getting down to our final 10 or 15 minutes, if Amy will give us a few more minutes for this discussion, but I know we're getting close. A final question that we wanted to ask everyone was to open it up a little bit and to get your perspectives as you leave these 2 days. What are some key ideas that you see as next steps for the community, activities or actions that we can be taking collectively or individually, perspectives on the discussion? And so really what we're doing is making the discussion an open discussion in the final 10 minutes. We just wanted to open it up, and not with, and I should say with this group, I don't think we had to say that. I think people have been saying what's on their mind anyway, but we did want to take the opportunity. What are your takeaways? What do you think should be our takeaways as a community? Where should we be going from here?
Well, Carl, we do have until 4:30.
Oh, we do?
I mean, 4. You're right. That's okay.
Oh, okay.
I take that back. My timekeeping is off. Well, do you want to we can pass the mic around, and if everyone wants just a chance to share. Now, we don't have a chance, and then we'll go back to you for the closing, to you and Monica and Alessandra and Jeff. And
that would be good.
So we'll just pass the mic around. If you want to share something, share it. Try to be mindful. There's a lot of people in the room, so make it quick.
And it would be good to ask everybody to say a couple words. Just if we have a few minutes to, hopefully not too many words, but just to give some reaction.
Good. I think we need to institutionalize the value chain perspective in our agency or across agencies, because it will help to set the standardization of what we are doing. I give you one example. The Ecosystem Services Memo issued in October 2015 has directed executive agencies and departments to institutionalize and take action on planning, investment, and regulatory context. And 13 executive agencies and departments took action, and now it is in the final stage, and Office of Management and Budget, Council on Environmental Quality, and Office of Science and Technology Policy, they all have done tremendous job, and we are about to get the final product after public comments. So I think institutionalization of this value chain perspective that we are working here would be a valuable asset.
Just pass it to Pierre. We'll just go around the table.
So this has been really interesting, and well, like all good science issues, it's opened up a lot more questions than provided the answers for me. but I've got maybe a few answers. So one of the questions that I think we might consider for a next meeting or next time would be the issue of scale. I think the issue of spatial temporal scales, both of say observations of information and of the people who are going to be making use of those that information, is something that we ought to think about more.
I would say keep the user in the loop. Involve the user from the very beginning. Instead of us guessing what they want, we can validate that, yep, this will actually work before we spend a lot of investment creating something that might not necessarily meet their needs.
Sorry, I was going to get more time to think.
Sorry.
So, a couple of thoughts. One is the user. Keeping the user in the loop is really important, but I also think that to some extent, there's a whole bunch of economists in there. The market is going to kind of govern and rule what happens a little bit, right? So we can't govern the creativity of things. We put this information out there, this technology and data that's out there, and people are going to use it in creative ways that can't be anticipated. And that's the beauty of it, right? So that's the other side of, there's one thing to anticipate what the users wants, which we're doing a big survey on that, right? But also to try and understand what are the creative things that happen as a result of building it and putting it out there. The other thing is that, I'm employing people to write these use studies, right? To go out and do case studies of people. So I'm hoping that we're going to have a shared email list where you can give me hints of where to go and people to seek out to do case studies on.
I think, Rudy, it's we need to share information. I think what we have here, we have a lot of people doing similar things. We definitely should create a platform that we can share our experience. So we know from each other connections about some of the studies, but we don't have really a wide view of everything that is happening. So if we could create a way of sharing, of being connected somehow, I think it would be very, very productive and exchange lessons learned from each other experience. I think it would be better.
I'm going to pass it to this next table, and I'm just going to ask you all to pick up the pace just a bit so we can get out of here at 4 o'clock. I know you all have so much to say, but I want everybody to get a chance.
2 comments, 2 questions that have been bothering me. First comments are on communications. Vocabulary matters, right? And I think we need a controlled vocabulary or a glossary as part of a document. And then the MIST principle, make it simple, stupid, would be something to keep in mind as we do some of those things and create products. The questions I had, which don't need to be answered right now, is whether models are part of Earth observations. There are actually some texts I was reading that suggest that they are, which simplify some of the discussions that we're having in the value chains. And then how much does observing cost right now?
I guess one thing that I would put forth as something to think about moving forward is identifying decision-making contexts in which Earth observations can play a role. I think this is something that our group had trouble with here in our value chain depiction here is, what decisions can be influenced, what decisions can't be influenced because of a variety of contexts and a variety of constraints, and that in itself requires a lot of research, I think. Understanding the Clean Water Act or the National Ambient Air Quality Standards or whatever the state of Utah's Department of Environmental Quality does with satellite data, right? And I think in addition to thinking about communications, thinking about the data products and the modeling, understanding the decision context is also a priority here.
I want to reiterate what Tad said about vocabulary. That's something in the harmful algal bloom realm right now. I don't necessarily mean the same thing when I say HAB as somebody else does. And so it's interesting to me that across these 2 very different types of communities, we're talking about vocabularies. So that's something to be very mindful of when we're communicating with each other and also across disciplines. And the other thing that strikes me that we've talked about a lot is the importance of our stories and collecting and gathering our stories in a way that we can share them and make them readily accessible. And we might find connections in interesting ways where stories about things that are happening on Lake Erie are directly relevant to ways that we're managing water supplies in Kansas, 2 very different types of systems with very similar stories and connections using the same kinds of information.
So I just want to second what Rashandra said about institutionalizing value of information. And I think also we need to connect with performance standards, and maybe this is a performance standard. So we really are making sure, especially as public agencies, that we're providing the best benefit for taxpayer dollars. And then I just also want to quickly say thank you to everyone for their engagement and energy. I think that especially today has provided us with a lot of new information, and everyone being so active in it has really created a great community.
I just want to say, I think that we need to have some focus on what the counterfactual is when we do these studies. To me, the counterfactual is always the most difficult thing to define, because usually it's something that doesn't exist that you're trying to define, and you can make or break a system by how you define that counterfactual. There was one graph yesterday that showed the counterfactual kind of below the value line that we're looking at. Well, if you define the counterfactual differently, that line is lower. If you define it, it's higher. So, just some guidance on how to define those counterfactuals in a meaningful, relevant way that's going to be useful, so someone doesn't look at it and say, boy, but I don't believe you're counterfactual. That's not realistic. That you should have done it this way. So just some thoughts got to be put into defining counterfactuals in a way that are going to be meaningful for the policymakers who are going to be using the information.
I'm just going to make a couple of quick comments. First, there was a discussion of simplicity versus complexity, a discussion of a web versus a single line. And I think we need to think through how to turn the complexity and express it so people appreciate it into something that's a simple story that people can use. Second thing is I want to agree on the counterfactual. It was mentioned but never really discussed. I'd like to emphasize that this is a multidisciplinary activity. And when we go home, let's remember that we have to not only talk to ourselves, but translate to other disciplines. And that's really a priority. So those are the comments.
I think about the group on Earth observations as a unique opportunity of a lot of different perspectives and broad reach. And something that's inspiring to me is the idea of thinking about the ideal state. So what would the system look like? What would the outcomes look like? What would the end result look like if the right people were informed, if we can feed the world and there can be clean energy and these things that kind of tie to our sustainable development goals. But and working backwards from that, what is there a project management aspect of, if we work 30 years back to today, what kinds of things do we need to be thinking about so we're removing blocks for the best future possible? So I think connecting to some of that visioning is really important. It's not just let's build from where we are, but also thinking about where we want to be. So I don't know if we delved into that, and I missed it because I wasn't here yesterday, but that's really interesting to me.
From my perspective, what I think, I want to back up what Pierre was talking about as far as scale, both in space and in time, and that there are uncertainties in using this data, and how do we get a policymaker to be able to trust the data enough to actually make a decision with it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess a lot of the things that I would have said have already been said. So the only thing that hangs out for me now is to get a good common understanding of what represents a supply chain, so that we have consistency and we see consistency across different studies.
I was here as a facilitator, so I don't really have much experience with Earth observations, but I've learned a lot, not only from this session, but also this discussion. I just want to thank you for letting me be a part of it, and it's allowed me to kind of connect some gaps in my own personal knowledge as well, so thank you.
I'm getting more comfortable with this. I do have to get the cooperation of some scientists who aren't, either because we spent a lot of money on economic analyses of certain eruptions in the past and they weren't pleased with them, or they're just uncomfortable with this. So I think their attitudes, even though I'm going to have the help of able economists within the USGS in the 6-month study we're embarking on, I think they may pose a sort of a limiting factor on how deep we go, which may not be a bad thing. It may be good to start simple as long as what we come up with is impactful. So I'm pleased.
Yeah, I have the same sort of concerns that when I go back, I'm going to talk about this on Thursday, about what I learned, and I'm going to be in front of a room of scientists, and I'm thinking that I don't know if others that produce similar kind of stuff, but their analyses appear to be more sexy than ours. And if I say something like that, then I can imagine that the scientists are going to be going, well, you know, we don't do that. And and we do need to maintain integrity and all that, and I understand, but there's still probably some room, and it's going to be hard, and it does take additional work, probably, to make it more presentable. And I don't know how well that will go.
I suspect that everyone in this room is either tied to government directly or indirectly, and certainly, you know, the funding for Earth observation for satellite platforms has been funded by the governments. But we now have, you know, the entry today into space by people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and these incredibly well-heeled individuals who have these long, forward-looking visions of things. I wonder how all of this might be changing as it transitions to private industry involvement.
Couple of quick thoughts. First of all, we have got within the GeoValue group a collaboration platform. We've used LinkedIn for about the last 5 years or so, so that exists if we want to pick up something that already exists. The second thing is that over the years I've collected together lots of studies that have been done around cost-benefit analysis. We need a platform. We need a GitHub platform, I think, for some of the tools, but alongside that, if you can take the software versus data analogy, you know, the data that we've brought together, I think, around this room and outside of it, needs an inventory. It needs to be put somewhere. I go back to what I said yesterday, which is the EVRY system, which is the environmental value inventory. We need one of those.
This has been a tremendously valuable exercise, particularly for me. I have a few comments, and maybe the first one is that don't forget the in situ observations. We talk about our satellites, but the in situ observations is a vital part of that information system. The second is when we move forward to that, I think we should think about a more universal approach to engaging with stakeholders. These discussions today had been very US-centric, and I think we need to be more universal to make that discussion more applicable to other government systems. And the third one is that we're talking about information, which is one step further down the line from observational data, and that implies that that observational data has passed some kind of a model or assimilation system to provide that data. So to you, Tad, I think that the observations or the modeling and assimilation is actually part of that value chain to get to information that we really want to value.
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, as we go away to our respective locations, if we're going to continue working on this, we need a mechanism to be able to communicate. And Andy, you mentioned the ability to have a directory or a repository, but we need that, and we need more. Probably some things that use technology like semantics and vocabularies should be included, and the use of co-design so that we can work across communities.
Yeah, I found this very interesting. I wasn't sure how I'd fit in here, not being an economist and really looking at this whole value chain thing. But I think what I've learned in the process is, we're a software company and we try to bring value to our users, shorten the time from data to understanding it to making decisions. But I think in that process, we've gained perspective on how to understand user needs. And I think there's a direct parallel there, so maybe we have something to contribute. And the other thing I was very excited to hear is that parallels worth saying. We've realized for a long time our community does great things with data. We've got great applications. We do great stuff, but we do it in our community. And we haven't been historically very good at communicating that out. And so I think I'm pleased to see that the kind of story maps picking up, because we saw that there's a real need to help people tell their stories, and that's what that's all about, and you can derive value from that.
So sometimes when I've thought about, kind of this idea of value of information or value chains, it's been kind of an overwhelming idea. And I think something that stood out particularly yesterday is that, kind of focusing on one narrative and communicating that is a good way to kind of simplify the process. And, especially when you think about it in terms of like a network, I think that we came up with some compelling value chains that were a little bit more focused. So that's something that I enjoyed.
One thing that I would suggest that we bear in mind, we talk often about the benefits applied to, a decision has beneficial outcomes, to think sometimes about negative externalities. So this is computationally intensive, everything that we're doing here. And so with the increase in observations, you have an increase in data, an increase in need for data management, assimilation, modeling, all types of things, which again requires a great deal of energy. So at the same time that we're thinking about applying what we are observing to environmental or other earth science processes, we are also, how many coal-fired power plants are required in order to maintain and analyze the data which we are using to think about that very problem. So just when we're doing this, to bring in, and that's one of many examples, but to bring that in when we're doing the valuation.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing that input. I'm going to turn it over to Alessandra, Jeff, Carl, and Monica for final thoughts. I don't know what order you all want to go in. But.
Well, before we do that, can I ask Andy, before you get up, you had some ideas about a future meeting, and I thought before we have final thoughts, if you'd be willing to share those ideas with the group?
So the GeoValue group has been going for about 10 years. The first meeting was in Ispra in 2006. And over that period of time, the community has got wider. There's been meetings which some of the people in here have been, including Francoise and Jay, been involved with right from the very beginning. At the moment, we're doing those in about an 18-month cycle, something like that. And it's traditionally been between the US and Europe, and it's Europe's turn next time. So in about 18 months' time, maybe we should have a meeting in Europe. UK will have been set free from Europe and floating into the mid-Atlantic, and you'll probably all need visas. No, hopefully not. But perhaps, and I'm just speaking, it's just an idea of mine at the moment. I have no money. I'm just a commercial guy. Somebody needs to pay for this to happen. But maybe there are enough people in this room and outside, because these meetings in general, most of us pay to go ourselves. But there are some fixed costs that are in this. My feeling is that we could easily do another meeting, and maybe let's have an aspiration to make it twice as big as this one next time round. I think if we act as fishermen, we go out and we teach the man to fish or the woman to fish. We can actually make this community much bigger, and I'd like to see us getting to the point that the environmentalists have got to, and the transport people, that there are master's degrees in transport economics, in environmental economics. Why should there not be the same kind of courses in geoeconomics? So maybe that's a sort of working title for our next GeoValue meeting, and if I can pull it together, and I'm quite happy to sort of try and do this with some people with some money, not large amounts of money, but small amounts of money. Let's do a GeoValue meeting 18 months from now in London.
Okay, that's a good proposal. Just a few words. I think on my side, I came here a bit skeptical about where these discussions about the value chain would end up. It seemed to me very theoretical that we could be able to define value chains, and I think I will come back with two main messages for myself and for the people there. It's that on one side, the fact that we all agreed on some techniques on value chain narratives is kind of reassuring, and if we can provide a stable and a kind of standardized or agreed approaches that give some robustness to the things that we are doing. And the other thought was that it could be useful also to have it as a reference to understand what's the variability of the different use cases. I mean, I have the impression that each table has been working on a value chain, but having in mind a specific use case. But for each value chain, there are so many different use cases. And with Jeff's study, we were often discussing, we were convinced that going for use cases, specific use cases, is the thing to do, because you can do it reliably, but it's just one single use case. Then there is how can you extrapolate it? And maybe if we can depict use cases in this value chain narrative, which is a bit of a homogeneous, it can be helpful to describe the variability and extrapolate the different cases that we address with mutual benefits around the community, and even as a validation or comparison. This being said, I think it was an intensive 2 days discussions. It was quite interesting for me, especially personally. And I thank all the participants. I think I will come back also with your proposal. I guess that the fact that it's in Europe or in UK, it will be, definitely it is, and in any case it's ESA. So thanks again. Thanks for the organization, especially to USGS and NOAA, and thanks for all to all the participants.
Yeah, I really just want to thank you everybody for coming. It was very intense, very good. I was so impressed that we got so much done in 2 days. Amazing. Amazing presentations. I learned a lot. So I just want to thank you, everybody, and especially the people that helped us put this together. So I just want to thank you, the facilitators. I know most of them are not here anymore. We have Chris. Thank you so much. I just want to thank you. Amy. What else we have here? Facilitators. That's it. The writers. Well, thank you, and especially Emily. Emily put everything together. It was, we couldn't have done it. So, yeah.
I feel I'm speaking out of turn now. I can't go around thanking everybody again. And maybe I abused a bit position earlier, and I apologise if I did, because I didn't speak and I kept back some comments to make now some takeaways from the meeting. I mean, I think it's been a great meeting. I really do. I think we've had some really good exchanges over the 2 days. I also had to excuse myself yesterday afternoon, unfortunately, for some European meetings. But from all the time I've been here, it's been really good. So what do I take? I think we have the basis of a best practice community to look into the value chain analysis, the value of information. We have a platform on which we can take forward, the GeoValue platform. I was also going to suggest a meeting in Europe, but I was going to say Brussels or Paris. So we have a three-way toss-up, a triangle to work out.
I'll go for Chamonix.
Sorry?
Chamonix.
Just outside, okay. The second thing was that the best practice community can be based and be supported by a resource repository, the EVRI that Andy has mentioned. I think that will be extremely useful to all of us to have something to draw upon. So one of the things we need is to work out how to put that together. I think we need to not forget that there are two types of messages we need to deliver. One is the quantitative, so the analysts, the supported analysis giving concrete numbers, and the other is the narrative. I think this came out quite strongly, so we should try to work on both those. And then the fourth is the framing messages and the communication, and to work with the guys in communication, the experts in communication, so that we make sure that we get the results of what we're doing across to the communities, the stakeholders, the decision makers that we're trying to influence. So I was going to thank everybody. I won't do so again, but just anyway, thank you for having us and hosting this meeting.
Just have a few words. I think this has been a fascinating 2 days. I think it's been a very productive discussion. I'm coming away with a more informed perspective about value chains and how they can be used both to explain the value of Earth observations and to communicate that. And I think they're both important. I think we do need to be able to understand what constitutes value, what changes occur because of Earth observations, and how we can make Earth observations and scientific information in general more useful, more valuable, and more productive in decision making. And I think the use of value chains is a mechanism, it's a platform that allows us to do that. And I think the discussion we had today across the 5 topical issues was very useful in that sense. At USGS, we have just received an assignment, and there's been some discussion about that, but our director has instructed us to look at the value of USGS scientific products, selected products, not all of them, in a quantitative way, to do estimates of this value. We're recognizing we're not going to come up with a precise value, but we've been asked to develop quantitative estimates of selected USGS scientific products. We have some, and now we have to add more across all of our scientific mission areas, which includes natural hazards, energy and minerals, environmental health, water resources, climate and land use change, and core science systems, and ecosystems. And so we have a very broad set of scientific information. And when we get back to the USGS this week, that's going to be one of our first activities, to sort of take what we discussed here for these 2 days and start an effort to really apply some of these concepts in a very, very quick, a very focused study to try to be able to both quantify the value and to communicate the value and to understand the value of our scientific information. So I think what we discussed here is of great value to us as we go forward in this, and we hope to maintain communications with many of you as we go forward. I just, in general, feel that this has been a very very productive 2 days. It follows up on a set of GeoValue meetings that we've had over the last number of years, and this is, I think, sort of taking the GeoValue concept and moving it forward in an applied sense. And how do we consider value chains, and how do we understand them better? And so, in a very general sense, I don't want to repeat all the thank yous because we've done that, but I do appreciate all of your time, all of your energy, and especially all of your good ideas in this discussion. So, again, we appreciate all the last 2 days, and have a good journey back. And we look forward to seeing you in London or Brussels or Paris, and we'll sort of let the competition begin.